Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Nick Bishop. I'm the partner manager here at aXcelerate. I'm very pleased today to introduce our partner, Chris Enright, who's the director of RTO Logic, who's going to take us through a webinar on exploring the new standards and overview. Chris is also running workshops on the new standards. These will be taking place in Sydney on Friday, the 23rd, and Brisbane, the 27th of August, as well as one in Melbourne on September 13th. We'll be popping in a link for anybody who's interested in registering. Coffee is required a little bit later, for these workshops. These will be hands-on workshops for anyone liking to know more. I'll pass over to our partner, Chris, to take us through the webinar. If there are any questions, we do have a Q&A section in Zoom. Please feel free to pop any of the questions into the Q&A as we go through. This webinar is being recorded and will be available after, and we'll send this link around to attendees for anybody who'd like to rewatch the webinar afterwards. But enough babbling from me. Over to Chris to explore the new standards.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously, a very hot topic indeed, and 45 minutes, as you could appreciate, is probably not going to do the topic justice. So what I'd like to do this morning is make sure everyone has a really good understanding of the journey so far, what those key or fundamental changes will be, and get you guys to think about what the impacts to your organization might be, not just when those standards become active, but also the impacts to your organization over the next 6 to 12 months or so as you prepare for implementation. So as Nick said, we do have a Q&A section where you can pop some questions down. We'll try to leave 15 minutes at the end of the session to address any of those questions. Just conscious of the fact that we've had quite a number of people register for the event, so I'll do my best to get through all of those questions as we go through the session. And so as I mentioned, we're going to take a quick look at the recent updates, look at the structural or the structure of the new standards, run through a couple of examples of how those standards might impact your organization, and then just talk briefly at the end about planning and next steps. So those recent updates, obviously this has been in the works for quite some time, and we're starting to see more and more conversation around these new standards. Our skills ministers met towards the end of May and agreed to progress the standards to public release in August this year. So there's no specific date, but August is the target month. So that's within 4 weeks away. And that's that meeting also, they also came to an agreement to extend the implementation out to the 1st of July 2025. So we'll have full regulatory effect from then. So that gives us probably about 8 months or so to ensure our organizations are ready for that new framework. So let's talk about the structure of the new standards. And I just want to run through a couple of key documents. So what you see on the screen here is an extract from the draft standards document, which is publicly available. And I'll share some links in the chat box for you shortly as well. This is a summary of some of the feedback that was received through the consultation process. And you can see there, they're saying that in addition, we heard from the sector that the current framework is complex and difficult to navigate. There are some tensions around the intersection of different elements and the mix of quality-oriented and compliance-focused requirements within the current standards. So the feedback around the complexity of that and the intersection or the mix of compliance and quality-focused lenses, if you like, resulted in DUA proposing a 3 documents or the split out of 3 separate documents. So one being the standards themselves, which is a new version of our current legislation, plus the addition of 2 supporting documents, those being a credential policy and a compliance document. So the credential policy is going to be a document that outlines the credentials or qualifications or skill sets that people will need to hold in order to perform training and assessment, validation, working under supervision, etc. And so that'll actually sit alongside the legislation. So we're going to go from a current set of legislation to a new set of legislation plus some supporting documents. The other document there is the compliance requirements. And so this will no doubt be the document that steps out some of those compliance-focused operational activities, such as the way that we market transparently and ethically, information that we need to share on our website. So all of those compliance-focused elements that are not necessarily listed or referenced in the standards or in the legislation themselves. So just to summarize, there's three sets of documentation there that we're looking at. The revised version of the standards, which is publicly available at the moment as a draft format, but it will change. And that will be released as a final version, according to the skills ministers, in August this year. And then the addition of the credential policy and compliance requirements. Now, that's the proposal so far. What comes in August we shall see. But the expectation is that there'll be those two supporting documents. We know that through the consultation process, there has been some adjustments made through that process. And we know that the most recent version of the draft standards has removed the engagement quality area. So we now have 4 quality areas within this framework. And so those 4 quality areas are training and assessment, learner support, vet workforce, and governance. So that engagement quality area received some mixed feedback and was rolled into part of the vet workforce or governance section. So where we have a current set of standards that sit across those chapters or that student life cycle, we are now moving towards 4 quality areas. And within those quality areas, we will have a set of standards. So this is a little bit hard to see on the screen perhaps, but this is taken off ASCA's website. This is the current set of 8 standards that makes up our current legislation. And we know that those 8 standards are reorganized into the student life cycle chapters, noting that we've got that logical progression through a student's interaction with our organization. Chapter 1, marketing and recruitment, and goes through to enrollment, support and progression, etc. So we know that that's the current framework. And we know now that what we're moving towards is 4 high-level quality areas, plus within each quality area, a set of standards. So at the moment in that draft version, there are 23 standards split across those 4 quality areas. And I know it's a little bit hard to see on the screen there, but that 1-pager image on the right-hand side shows the standards. So we can see there in training and assessment, the first standard, standard 1.1, is under the training section and says training delivered is engaging and well-structured. We also have the introduction of performance indicators, and performance indicators will sit under each relevant standard. So this is directly in response to feedback from providers that the standard should provide direction to RTOs and regulators. And so this is where the detail around how an organisation would demonstrate compliance would sit. So those indicators just provide us as providers with greater clarity or information around systems and processes that we should have in place. So we're going to have 4 quality areas, standards within each, and then under each standard that you see on that page there, we'll then have performance indicators that sit within each of those standards. And so it's the performance indicators that will provide us with the detail on those systems and processes. Here's an example of the structure that we've just spoken about. So here we've got quality area 2, which is learner support. We have a high-level statement about the objective of that quality area. And then we have one of the standards that sits under that quality area. And then within that standard, we have additional detail around how we would implement systems or processes to comply with that standard. So I can see questions coming in at the moment. Now, I know participants can't necessarily see all of those questions, but we have had a question that's relevant to what we've just spoken about, which was marketing was also removed from the quality areas table. Has this been moved somewhere else? Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's going to be the introduction of a compliance document and credentials policy, and those are referenced in the draft version of the standards. So all of that information like marketing, yes, that person who put that question in is correct. It's not in the current draft standards, but it will pop up in the compliance documentation. So those two documents, the credential policy and compliance document, will sit alongside the legislation and support it, and will provide the detail or the mechanics of some of that. So revised version of the standards, keep an eye out for the communication in August, because that's when we've been told that everything will be finalized. Look out for the credential policy and compliance requirements. And then in addition to that, as we know, the regulator will provide supporting documentation, whether it's through the form of website information, fact sheets, webinars or podcasts, and additional communication as well. So very similar approach to what we have under the current standards. If we want additional information, we can jump onto ASQA's website, we can look through the user guide, we can download fact sheets, we can watch webinars, etc. Just want to talk quickly about the credential policy as well. So we know that the credential policy is not publicly available, hasn't been published yet, but we do know that it's referenced in the current draft standards. And so this will be a separate document that will contain all of the credentials required for delivering training and assessment independently. So what do we need to hold if we are to operate independently as a trainer assessor? What do we need to hold if we are training under supervision? What do we need to have if we're supervising trainers or assessing only, or even conducting validation? So when we go into chapter 4 in the current standards, when we go and have a look at those trainer requirements, we can see all of that information listed in the standard, and it will often reference Schedule 1, and it will have a dot point list of qualifications or skill sets that we need to hold to perform certain activities. So what we're going to see in the new framework is that being separated out of the standards and placed into this credentials policy. So to summarize what some of those requirements will be, very much the same as what we have now, noting that we obviously had some changes made to the current legislation that were released in March this year around providing greater flexibility for providers when recruiting trainers and assessors. So in terms of validation and the requirements that will be stepped out in this policy, it will explicitly state what needs to be held or what we need to have in order to participate and lead validation. So very much the same sort of information. Conducting validation will still require industry skills, knowledge and experience relevant to that training product. We'll still need to hold the appropriate TAE qualification or education qualification to participate in that process. And we'll still need to have a good understanding of current industry practices. And so as we know, we can have a team of people working on that validation activity that collectively hold or can demonstrate all of those requirements. We will most likely also see a continuation of the same guidance around trainers who have made those assessment judgments, not being able to validate their own decisions. As I said before, we'll see the specific expectations of TAE training products in terms of those providers who deliver TAE training products and the requirements to conduct external validation. So we should see much the same with respect to that. In terms of operating independently as a fully qualified trainer and assessor, you'll need to hold one of the following qualifications. So I've just put the codes in there. So the 40122 or the 40116. Previously or historically, we've been required to upgrade the 40110 to the equivalent of 116 by having those additional units of competency. What we're going to potentially see here based on the recent changes in March is where providers will be allowed to use trainers and assessors who only hold the 40110 but do not hold those upgraded units. And that will be an effort to assist training providers in recruiting suitable trainers and assessors in a marketplace that is suffering from shortages. Also, importantly, for those who may hold a secondary teaching qualification, in addition to that qualification or that degree, they could potentially hold one of those following skill sets and be recognised to the equivalent of someone who is holding the full Cert 4 TAE. And as we know, much the same again, holding a diploma or high-level qualification in that adult education and vocational education training package. Providing direction is an interesting change in language too. So I mentioned on a couple of slides ago supervision, and that's the language that we're accustomed to from the current set of standards. What we're seeing in the new documentation is a shift in language from supervision to direction. And so providing direction still requires that person to hold the relevant qualifications. And again, very similar to operating independently as a trainer assessor, holding those same skill sets alongside a teaching qualification or the Cert 4 requirements. We'll also see an extension of that providing direction piece, very similar to what we have under the current legislation, where we will need to document and ascertain or determine the level of support required to work out how our feedback loops will work, and to document and evidence all of that. For those of you who may hold a teaching degree or a secondary teaching qualification, you can hold one of those other approved skill sets alongside that. And so I'll just put that there in the bottom of that slide. And there will be a recommendation that the organisation, the RTO makes consideration of the context in which you're delivering. So if someone holds a secondary teaching qualification and they hold one of those skill sets, if they're operating in a vet in schools environment, it would make sense for them to hold the vet delivered to school students teacher enhancement skill set. So even though technically you could hold a teaching qualification plus that first assessor skill set there, if you're operating in a vet in schools environment, the regulator is going to expect that you are looking at ensuring that for best practice purposes, that person holds the specific skill set that's relevant to their operating context. And just making a note, I can see lots of questions coming in. What I'll do is I'll just defer to some of those to the end of the session. I'll address them when we get through a couple of these slides. The credential policy should also step out guidance around those who do not hold a TAE qualification. And we've seen some recent changes in March, and we know that this is a bit of a dividing debate within industry at the moment as well. And so the idea here will be that a person can be actively working towards their training and assessment qualification, working under the direction of a qualified trainer. And that will mean something along the lines of being enrolled and having commenced training in the appropriate TAE qualification, and being able to demonstrate that they're making satisfactory progress towards completion within 2 years. Now, how that's evidenced, we will wait and see what guidance comes out around that, but essentially means we can start recruiting under that framework non-TAE qualified individuals who don't even hold the skill set, the minimum skill sets, to be working under direction or under supervision, as we're accustomed to referring to it, as long as they're able to demonstrate that they're working towards completing that TAE qual. Interestingly, the language that's referenced in some of these documents talks about contributing to assessment, but not being able to complete or finalise assessment. So I think we'll see greater, maybe a tightening up of the language around whether or not those working under supervision, working towards the TAE qual, can participate in any part of that assessment practice. So we know that they can't make assessment judgments under the current legislation. So that's an area of concern that we want to see, perhaps over the next 4 weeks or so, what guidance comes out in those final versions around that. So someone asked the question before about marketing elements being removed. from the quality areas and being put somewhere else, and they were, possibly going to be put into that compliance documentation. And so these are some of those elements that you might see in the compliance document, which you don't necessarily see explicitly referenced in the current draft version of the standards within those new 4 quality areas. And so that's things like marketing and advertising. I've just put the current legislation standard reference in brackets there, so you know where it's coming from. But some of this information is what we should expect to see in that compliance document. So this will be more of the operational considerations or compliance-focused considerations. So assessment, retention, marketing and advertising, use of the NRT logo, third-party arrangements, insurances, a lot of that stuff that we see in Chapter 6 as well of the current student lifecycle under the current standards. So expect to see a separate document dedicated to providing additional detail around some of these requirements that we can't currently see in the draft standards. We would expect to see greater focus on security of personal information. We know that there's, that's a hot topic at the moment, data security and personal privacy. So expect to see some more communication around that. And we may also see a couple of things. We may see an increase in the assessment evidence retention requirements. I would anticipate that will be extended from 6 months to 12 months. But there's nothing written down at the moment, so we'll wait and see. And I would also expect to see greater clarity around the treatment of superseded training products. And so how we manage that transition period. So I'd expect to see greater clarity around that, possibly with no new enrollments after the first year and no time limit on completion of existing learners. So we'll just have to wait and see. That's speculative. So I just want to be really clear about the difference between the speculative stuff and the stuff that's written down. But worth keeping note or paying attention to what comes out in the next 4 weeks to see what comes of those things. So I want to run through a couple of examples of how the new framework might impact your organizations. And so we can see here, we've got that one pager on the right-hand side, which is the 4 quality focus areas with the standards underneath them. So the only thing missing from that page is the performance indicators. And then obviously a credential policy and compliance document. And so as an example, we know that in the training and assessment piece in quality area 1, we have validation activities are determined via a risk-based approach. So there's language that talks to organizations implementing a risk-based approach to determining those validation activities. And so from a policy procedure impact, we might have to then go and review our current approach to validation and update our policy and procedures, update our validation tools or schedules, and even some of our pro forma as well. So as an example, currently, an RTO might have a 5-year validation schedule where they validate 50% of their training products in the first 3 years. And they'll, at a minimum, to meet the minimum standards, they might pull out 2 units of competency from each qualification, and then they might look at the last 6 months of assessment judgments for those units of competency at the time that they are conducting validation as per their schedule. They'll then jump onto ASQA's website and they'll use the calculator that's provided to calculate the sample sizes. So they'll put the population size in with their 95% confidence interval and 15% error rate, and that will spit out a sample size. And then they'll randomly select students from that sample. So what we might see is providers now needing to take a look at their validation schedule and implementing some kind of risk assessment tool to determine where the focus areas should be. So what units should we be pulling out of those training packages? How frequently should we be doing validation? And what should our sample sizes look like? So rather than doing minimum standard, which is validate a qual or a training product once in a 5-year cycle with a minimum of 2 units and 6 months of assessment judgment, we might then need to look at a process where we conduct risk assessment. We might identify that one of our qualifications is a high risk qualification. And as part of our risk assessment, we determine that based on our delivery modes, the cohorts that we work with, or the nature or complexity of the training product, that we deem some training products at a higher risk than others on our scope of registration. And as such, we decide, based on that risk assessment, to increase the frequency of validation. So instead of validating that training product once in a 5-year cycle, we might validate it 3 times. And we might validate it early on in the cycle, and then at the midpoint, and then towards the end. And so what we're doing is we're actually going above minimum standard, and we're using risk assessment and judgment to determine validation frequency and sample sizes. So that's an example of how the language has changed in the new standards, and how that might impact on policies, procedures, proformas, schedules, and the way that we approach, in generally speaking, validation. So what I've got on the next slide is just a summary, an extract from that draft set of legislation that just dot points the high-level changes with respect to that first quality area, which is training and assessment. And so we can see things there like strengthening requirements relating to the quality of training, replacing the concept of amount of training, and this is a really important one, replacing the concept of amount of training, which the sector identified as confusing, with a requirement that RTOs ensure training provides sufficient time for instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment. So in other words, rather than allowing our delivery to be about the number of hours, it's more about taking a holistic approach and understanding the cohort and the cohort's needs, the complexity of the training product, our proposed delivery models, and then using all of that information holistically to make an assessment or a judgment about how we should best engage and support those learners through that training product. So that's a massive shift. And we've seen in recent weeks, ASQA has actually published updated guidance around amount of training for providers. So if you haven't seen that already, it's worth jumping onto the website and having a look at that. So there are a whole bunch of high-level changes. Now, if you want to see this information in your own time, I'll provide a link at the end of this session where you can download that directly from DUA's website. In the learner support section, so quality area 2, as an example, we can see the inclusion for providers to provide written information to learners about the agreed training and learner obligations prior to any fees being paid. So what it's saying is we need to provide that information about course structure, learner obligations before they pay. So from a procedural perspective, we may need to then go back and review how we engage and share information with prospective learners before they make that decision to pay and enroll in that program. So there might be some changes to our enrollment processes. Where this might have a big impact is on providers who take payment upfront for short courses. So if you're offering first aid courses, which are short course, high volume programs, and you've got a payment gateway on your website where people can just jump on, pay for the course and book in, how are you going to demonstrate as a provider that you've ensured learners have written information about the agreed training and learner obligations prior to them paying for that course? So that's a really big one. And again, this is an extract straight out of that draft standards document. And we can see a couple of summarized high-level changes there for the legislation. So clarifying language around the support for learners under the age of 18, nuanced requirements around learner well-being. So there's quite a few considerations in there, and I am conscious about time as well. So I'm not going to go through each of these points because I just want to make sure we've got enough time to address the questions that are coming into the chat. Quality area 3, which is the vet workforce section. And so again, I'm just providing one example here, how the RTO fosters continuing professional development and support for staff to understand and meet the standards. So what it's saying is, how do we as an organisation ensure that all of our staff, not just trainers and assessors, participate in relevant, meaningful professional development? And how do we ensure that they understand their obligations under the standards, whether they're someone who works in data entry, someone who works in student support, or the owner or operator of the organisation? So from a policy procedural impact, we might need to go back and look at how we identify the required skills and knowledge for all of our admin staff, our management, and then devise a strategy to implement effective, meaningful professional development. So as an example, in addition to what we currently do around professional development for trainers and assessors, we may need to go out and conduct a needs assessment or a capability assessment and implement a professional development plan for all of our staff. So this VET workforce or workforce capability section is quite a significant change in language and focus compared to the current legislation. And again, we can see there a couple of high-level changes. Strengthening the focus on workforce planning to ensure a sufficient quality VET workforce, and clarifying and streamlining the wording around trainer and assessor competencies, which will see greater or deeper information in the credentials policy, and then also introducing clearer controls around the use of industry experts to minimise the risk of exploitation. So the VET workforce is a big change or shift in language and focus. And then we get to that final quality area, which is governance. And so governance, as an example, one of the inclusions is leadership is effective in building and promoting a positive organisational culture. Again, from a policy procedural impact, there may be changes required to the organisation's policies to address explicit references to organisational culture, cultural safety for First Nations staff and learners, and other considerations that we might need to make in our operating context. So for example, currently, we may not be thinking about these things. What we might need to look at doing is implementing some cultural awareness training for our staff. That might feed nicely into our VET workforce strategy, but also improving staff and learner onboarding processes and strengthening those processes. So when we bring someone into our organisation, how do we set the expectations around all organisational culture and cultural safety? And there are explicit references also to First Nations staff and learners. So we will need to have dedicated policies that address these requirements. So again, another example of where we might need to go back and review our policies and procedures and implement or adjust those existing procedures to meet the new standards. And again, finally, just a snapshot of some of those key changes or tweaks to the existing legislation. So here, things like changing the term management to governing persons to better reflect the diversity of RTO governance. So what the regulator is going to want to see under this new regulation is a very strong focus on positive culture and strong governance practices. We know that under the current legislation and after a couple of years of work, we have a draft definition for self-assurance. And we know that self-assurance is a big focus for the regulator under the current legislation. How does an organisation self-assure continually? Because we know that the regulator is a risk-based regulator. They can't come in and micromanage 4,100 RTOs. They do require us to take ownership and implement systems and strategies to ensure that we're continually improving and monitoring our practices across our whole operations. Okay, so we know that in the existing legislation, there are elements there for self-assurance. They're just not explicitly called out as self-assurance activities. But some examples of self-assurance activities would include validation schedules, reviews of training and assessment strategies to review their effectiveness, feedback loops, surveys, industry consultation. These are all the activities that we're already doing under the current legislation. But we need to work out how we can articulate that and frame that within that self-assurance piece. So just a couple of things to consider as part of that transition from current state to future state across the next couple of months. So some of the questions you might ask yourself are, is my organisation meeting this requirement already? So under our current set of processes, are we already doing these things? And I think it's important for providers to as they go through this process of transitioning to a new legislation or a new set of standards, that they first need to be really confident in their capability to address the current set of legislation, because we know that the current legislation is going to be 85, 90% of what's in the new legislation. It's just going to be framed slightly differently, and there'll be a few additional requirements in there. But if we want to transition effectively to new legislation and tweak policies and procedures, we really need to be comfortable first with our organisation's ability to comply with the current legislation. So is our organisation currently meeting those requirements? And are we potentially meeting some of the additional requirements in the draft standards as well, but we perhaps haven't articulated that? And if not, what do I need to adjust in my processes, in my pro forma, in my staff capability in order to meet that new level of standard that we're setting under the new legislation? Do I need to create additional forms, or can I amend existing ones? And who needs to be informed of those changes? So what training do I need to roll out for staff or for other stakeholders who interact with our organisation, whether it be a third party, independent provider that we're working with, or trainers and assessors and other internal stakeholders, or even clients of ours that we might be delivering training to. And so just to get you thinking about some of these things, I'll put a couple of examples up on the screen. So this is from Quality Area 2, and it says reasonable adjustments are made to support learners with disability to access and participate in training and assessment on an equal basis. And that's the standard that we see on that one-pager document. And what we see below is the performance indicators that I mentioned before. And these performance indicators are directly relevant to Standard 2.1 under that draft legislation. The RTO demonstrates how policies and procedures reflect requirements of the National Disability Law, how it supports learners to disclose their disability if they wish, how it offers reasonable adjustments as suited to the learner and training product, and where reasonable adjustments are not possible, the reasons why, and how these have been communicated effectively to the learner. So we need to start to think about this under that new framework, and we may already be doing this under our current policies and procedures. And if that's the case, that's fantastic. But for many of you, you may need to go back and revisit your policies and procedures. So we can see there, the first thing we need to look at is, well, have we addressed the requirements of the National Disability Law? Do we know what those requirements are? And if not, what training do we need to implement to ensure that our staff are aware of the National Disability Law? And how does that impact the operations in our organisation? From the way that we communicate with people to the decisions we make about determining suitability for a program. And if we need to, we might need to update policy and procedure statements. How do we as an organisation support learners to disclose their disability? So we might have standard enrolment form questions, but is there a process that we can implement as part of that enrolment process where we allow the student a really good opportunity to disclose any issues that they might have or any challenges that might impede on their ability to participate in the program? And importantly, what do we do if we get to arrive to a decision where we don't think this student is suitable for this program for whatever reason it might be? And how do we communicate that with the student in a respectful but effective way? And so that's what this set of performance indicators and this standard is trying to address. And then finally, another example, and this will be the last one because I do want to jump into some Q&A. Wellbeing needs of the learner cohort are identified and strategies put in place to support these needs. Okay, so this is again out of Quality Area 2, and the performance indicators say that the RTO demonstrates how it identifies the wellbeing needs of the learner cohort as relevant to the training content and the appropriate wellbeing support services. It advises learners of the wellbeing support services available and how to access those services, and where the RTO offers training and assessment to young learners, how risks to their safety and wellbeing are identified and managed consistent with the principles for child-safe organisations, having regard to the training content and mode of delivery. So we may already be running processes where we identify student support needs through the consideration of literacy and numeracy skills through an LLN test, through questions that we might ask students as part of an enrolment interview, where we're asking them about their objectives, career objectives, vocational objectives, to make sure that they're aligned to this program. As part of that, we may also now need to implement a set of wellbeing services, which can be categorized slightly differently to traditional student support or reasonable adjustment. So this might be additional services to address mental health, and noting that this doesn't necessarily need to be capability that we build within our own organization, but rather awareness, policies and a framework to support it, and then referrals out to external or independent providers or organizations who can provide some of these services as well. So we know that under the new legislation, we need to specifically address or explain how wellbeing needs are met. So we do need to have a process for that, but we also recognize that it's not always going to be possible for us to offer all of those services. So we need to go out and build relationships with other entities so that we can offer those support services where appropriate. Okay, so I just wanted to give you those two examples, breaking them down with the performance indicators, so that we can sort of see a couple of things here. We can see how the performance indicators are designed to provide the detail around policies and procedures and systems to address those standards under those quality areas, but also to get you thinking about how you might need to go back and revisit existing practices and move from current state to future state. And ideally, you're going to be able to do that soon to give yourselves as much time as possible to prepare for that live implementation in July 1st, 2025. So where does that leave us now then? As I said before, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you understand how your organization currently complies with the current legislation. If you don't have a strong understanding or grasp of the current set of RTO obligations, and you can't articulate how your organization demonstrates compliance against those current standards, then it's going to be really difficult to move from current state to future state. So that's the first thing that I would be doing, is conducting a health check on your current status. That would allow you to conduct a gap analysis with respect to the new standards. So the next step is obviously understanding the new standards in detail, and specifically how they will be interpreted by regulators and providers, and what best practice might look like in terms of policies, procedures, pro forma, and communication. Using that knowledge of the new standards and your current performance under the current standards to conduct that gap analysis and map out what those required changes are. And I'd be building out a project plan for that, because if we don't get onto this soon, if you haven't commenced looking at this already, time will run out very quickly. As we know, as we approach the year, things get busy, people go on leave. We end up with a couple of months of not too much activity occurring, and then we're back into the new year hitting the ground running. And that doesn't leave a lot of time to be ready for implementation in July 1st. So map that out into a project plan to ensure that you can get to a point where you're comfortable and perhaps you've road tested some of these changes in your organization prior to that implementation date. ASQA's website also has a bunch of different pages, and JUA's website does too, that provide some basic communication around how they're progressing with this. And what I'll do is I'll put into the chat box very shortly some of the links to those pages, and you can just copy them out and you might be able to get some value out of that. And so here we've just got that communique from ASQA talking about those next steps and how you might be preparing for implementation of those standards. So that brings us to the end of the slides. And I think I've perfectly timed that for 45 minutes, which gives us 15 minutes opportunity to address questions that came in through the Q&A, and for me to share the relevant links that might help you navigate some of this stuff as well. So before we start that, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone who has participated in the session this morning. I know we've rushed through that very, very quickly, and I know I haven't done it justice because we only had that 45 minutes. But I hope we've given you enough to think about, so you can go back to your organization and start to think about how you might map this out, this transition from current state to future state. So thank you for joining us. And what I'll do is I'll just hang on the line for 15 minutes and I'll start to address some of these questions for the audience. Okay, so just reading through those questions, I know you can't all see those questions, but this question there saying, will there be an updated version of the ASQA self-assessment? So that person's referring to the self-assessment checklist or tool that's available for download on ASQA's website. I have no doubt that that will be updated in due course. It might be something that comes online next year or even later this year. So my understanding is that it's the intention of the regulator to commence education activities once the standards have been published and finalised. So right now we're still in that holding pattern where we have information, but we don't have signed off, ministerial sign off on those final versions. So once that comes into effect, that's when we'll start to see the regulator implementing all of those educational activities. And that will be in the form of podcasts, webinars, articles, how-to guides, fact sheets, updated pages on the website. And you should see a lot of that, or expect to see a lot of that towards the end of this year, at least after the official sign-off in August. And obviously, as part of that, documents like the self-assessment checklist will need to be updated. Are the two supporting documents, credentials and compliance, enforceable? So yes, so those documents will sit alongside legislation. So currently what we have is one set of legislation that has everything. And the feedback has been that that's been quite confusing for people to navigate, because often there are a combination or intersection of quality-focused statements, high-level overarching statements or motherhood statements, mixed in with compliance-specific operational statements. And so the idea is that we're splitting the two out. So the legislation or the quality focus areas or quality areas with the standards and their performance indicators is what we'll refer to as the legislation. That legislation refers out to the credential policy and compliance documentation, and they will also be enforceable and form part of our regulation. But they'll sit alongside that legislation. So what that will mean practically in the future is if the regulator wants to make changes to trainer assessor requirements, they don't have to go through the same costly, timely exercise of updating nationally agreed legislation. What they can do is they can adjust those documents and be more responsive and more agile to changing industry needs. So those two documents will have greater flexibility in terms of the changes and the timelines around those changes. So to answer the question, yes, it will be enforceable, but it will be more flexible in terms of the regulator's ability to adjust. I've got a question here. Will the new credential policy address the anomaly where aviation trainers don't need to hold TAE 40116 or 40122? Very specific question. Probably can't answer that. That would be a question for the regulator, but I'm sure if it's already addressed under current legislation, then it would be addressed in the standards. Keeping in mind that we also have training package assessor requirements where we might have stipulations within the training packages as well. So that would be a question that I couldn't answer, I'm afraid. In the case of RTOs delivering courses for employers, where the RTO receives direct nomination from employers for their employees, what would be the best practice to ensure employers have provided course details to their employees before finalising their nomination to an RTO? Is it okay for the RTO to share course-related details at the time of sending enrolment details? Really good question, quite a complex question. So a couple of things to consider here. One is it doesn't matter who's paying for the course or who's organising the training, your relationship is with the RTO to the student directly. And so regardless of whether an employer is saying, hey, we need you to come in and train these 10 staff, we'll organise their paperwork, we'll get everything sorted, you have to recognise as a training provider that your relationship is with that student. And under the legislation, both current and proposed new legislation, it is a requirement for the provider to determine that that is a suitable program, to ensure that you have communicated all of the relevant information to the student directly so that you can ensure they are making an informed choice about provider and course. And that could be information disseminated directly by the RTO or through a third party. And so then we cross over into that territory where you have an independent entity who is not the RTO providing course information and marketing materials, perhaps, to students, to prospective learners. So in those cases, you would want to have a really strong documented business process that talks to how you, A, ensure that the information that's being provided to students is information that you've approved and it's accurate, how you evidence or demonstrate that you maintain at all times a continual line of communication between you and the student. So you need to be able to pick up the phone and call the student or email a student. That relationship is between you and the student, regardless of who's paying for the course or how that enrollment process works. So you will need to consider that. One important observation in the new legislation around that specifically is the change in language around determining suitability for a program for that student based on a set of considerations, including consideration of literacy and numeracy. So this is going to be a really big one for providers, particularly high volume short course providers who take enrollments online and payment online before they've even spoken to the student. How do you ensure that you've determined suitability in consideration of LLN prior to that event happening? It's a really big one, and I think we'll see more communication or more guidance around how we might treat that in different ways. So I hope that answers your question, but it's a really tricky one when you've got cases like that. What's going to be important is that you can go back to the legislation, pull that out, and then talk to, in a policy and procedure, how you meet those requirements. And there will be ways that you can navigate that. It's a bit of a longer conversation, which I'm happy to have, but it will take a bit longer. If we refer students to Beyond Blue for mental health support services, would you suggest that we have an agreement with them, or is it not required? If yes, does it constitute a third party? So no, it wouldn't constitute a third party agreement. You wouldn't need to have a formal agreement in place. What you would need to have is a very clear set of policies and procedures or direction about what your RTO does to support students, specifically student wellbeing. So that could be a statement that says, these are the ways in which our organisation addresses student wellbeing. We assess it at this point in our process. We document it here. We provide additional information or referral out to independent providers to help inform and educate our students on other available service offerings. And you would have a student handbook that might list some of those services as well. And so that could just be you saying, we recommend these places. But more importantly, it's about you having a conversation with the student and identifying some of these requirements or these challenges and saying, hey, might be great if you went and spoke to these guys. I'm happy to send you an email with a link. So I think we'd open up a can of worms if we went down constituting those as third-party agreements. So that's kind of where we would go. Very much the same to what you're currently doing with respect to student support, where in your student handbook, you might have a list of agencies that you refer students to, the reading, writing hotline, whatever it might be, very much the same. What we need to look at is how we explicitly address the student wellbeing and how we define student wellbeing versus support needs as part of that overall sort of pre-training review or pre-enrollment assessment piece. What is the link about the updated guidance for trainers? So the credential policy is not published yet, but it will be in August apparently. So that will be something that you need to look out for in the next couple of weeks. There is some, we did see the changes to some of the trainer requirements that were released in March. So we've almost got 3 versions. We've got the standards, current standards as we've known it for 9 years. We've got the current standards with the changes that were implemented to those current standards in March. And that link, if you just go back onto ASQA's website to Chapter 4 of the Student Lifecycle, you'll see those changes reflected on their web pages. And then we've got the new legislation as well. So something to look out for, that credential policy, but you can get the existing requirements through ASQA's website directly. And I will try, I know we're running out of time, but I will try and put some of those links in the chat box as well. So what I'll do is I'll just drop a couple of those links that might be relevant. And if people have the opportunity, you're welcome to just copy those.
Chris?
Yep.
What we can also do, if you're happy, we can share those links when the recording goes out to the attendees of today's webinar.
That'd be great. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer all these questions because there are more questions coming in than I can answer.
Yeah, they keep
That's just the nature of having a couple hundred people in the session. So I do apologize if I don't get to your question. I'm also very happy if we can collect these questions. I'm happy to provide answers to them, and maybe we have a Q&A document or something like that if people would like.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, so we can get those the questions we can't get to put together, and we can send those out as part of the email to go to attendees with the recording.
Right. Now I'm going to do a shameless plug here, if that's okay as well, because I know that 45 minutes is not long enough for us to cover everything we need to cover off. And I know there's lots of questions that come out of these conversations. So we are running a series of workshops across Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane, and the dates are on the screen there as well. They're co-facilitated by himself and Andrew Shea, who's another very well-educated or connected person in the sector and has great oversight on the sector as well. And so those workshops will be full-day hands-on workshops. We'll also be providing a range of free policy and procedure templates and pro forma that might help you navigate those new standards. And we're also offering participants the ability to follow up with a meeting, a one-on-one meeting with the presenters post those workshops to help support them through their implementation project planning as well. So if you're interested in that, we can put some links in the chat as well. But that's my shameless plug for the moment. I know we're sort of bang on time at the moment and we didn't get to all those questions. But once again, thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this morning's session. I do hope you got some value out of it. And I will do my best to address those questions post this webinar.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Again, shameless plug for Chris. Workshops in Sydney on Friday, 23rd of August, Brisbane on Tuesday, 27th of August, and Melbourne, September 13th. For anybody in those cities who'd like to attend the workshops with Chris, we will include a link for registering when the webinar recording goes out. I also have a shameless plug to throw in there because I'm contractually obligated, especially these days. So again, thank you. And thank you very much, Chris, but also be sure to join us at aXcelerate Day this year at Brisbane Convention Centre on October 30th to discover all the latest and greatest aXcelerate news and innovations, as well as talking to our partners. And we will have a presentation from NCVER during aXcelerate Day on the National Vet Data Standard Future Changes. And that is about to be released in our Heartbeat newsletter as well. So a little bit of early information for those that are on the call. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you, aXcelerate, for hosting that as well.
Pleasure. Take care, everyone.